By the summer of 1945, Imperial Japan was no longer engaged in a struggle for victory. It was engaged in a struggle for survival. The empire that had once expanded rapidly across East Asia and the Pacific now found itself isolated, exhausted, and strategically broken. Allied naval forces controlled the surrounding seas, while submarines systematically destroyed what remained of Japan's merchant fleet. Shipping lanes that once carried oil, food, and raw materials had become lethal corridors from which few vessels returned. Without access to external resources, the foundations of Japan's war economy began to crumble. Fuel shortages spread through every layer of society. Trains ran sporadically or stopped altogether. Fishing boats remained close to shore, unable to venture far enough to provide reliable food supplies. Factories that had survived earlier bombings often stood idle, not because of a lack of workers, but because electricity failed or essential materials no longer arrived. Industrial output collapsed, and with it, any realistic capacity to continue large-scale warfare. What remained was an economy operating on fragments, improvisation, and exhaustion. The war had also reached Japan's cities in the most direct and devastating way. Night after night, air raid sirens cut through the darkness as bombers approached. Urban centers built largely of wood and paper were uniquely vulnerable. Fires spread faster than civil defense crews could respond. Entire neighborhoods vanished in hours, leaving behind scorched foundations, twisted rails, and rivers choked with ash and debris. By daylight, adult civilians moved silently through the ruins, searching for missing relatives, salvaging usable materials, and queuing for water and food that often never arrived. Millions were displaced. Schools, tunnels, temples, and makeshift shelters became places of refuge. Hunger became routine rather than exceptional. Disease spread easily among exhausted populations living in overcrowded conditions. The state struggled to maintain even the appearance of order. For many civilians, the idea of victory had already disappeared. Survival from one day to the next became the only goal that mattered. Yet within Japan's leadership, surrender remained almost unspeakable. Years of ideology and wartime indoctrination had equated endurance with virtue and compromise with disgrace. Defeat was framed not as a military outcome, but as a moral catastrophe that would invalidate every sacrifice already made. Even as the nation collapsed around them, hardline voices insisted that resistance itself was proof of national strength. Japan, trapped between physical ruin and ideological rigidity, stood at the edge of a decision that would determine whether it continued toward annihilation or found a way out of the war. Japan's refusal to surrender in 1945 was not based solely on military calculations. It was the result of an ideology that had been built, reinforced, and weaponized over decades. Within the Japanese military and political elite, war was not viewed simply as a contest of strength, but as a moral trial. Victory validated the nation's spirit. Defeat called its very identity into question. In such a framework, surrender was not a strategic option. It was a form of national death. Military doctrine emphasized absolute loyalty and sacrifice. From the earliest stages of training, soldiers were taught that endurance was the highest virtue and that yielding to the enemy erased honor. These beliefs did not end at the front lines. They shaped decision-making at the highest levels of government, where senior officers believed that the willingness to suffer could itself become a weapon. The idea took hold that Japan did not need to defeat the Allies outright. It merely needed to demonstrate such total resistance that the cost of invasion would become unbearable. By 1945, this belief had hardened into policy. Plans were drawn for a massive defense of the home islands, despite the fact that Japan lacked fuel, air cover, naval strength, and adequate weapons. Civilian populations were discussed not primarily as people to be protected, but as a reserve of endurance that could support national resistance. The expectation was not survival without suffering, but survival through suffering. Hardship itself was portrayed as proof of righteousness. Any voice that questioned this logic faced immediate resistance. Advocates of negotiation or surrender were accused of weakness, defeatism, or betrayal. Rational assessments of Japan's strategic position were dismissed as lacking spirit. As a result, ideology replaced adaptability. The leadership became locked into a mindset that allowed only one acceptable direction: continued resistance, regardless of consequence. This ideological rigidity created a dangerous illusion. It convinced many leaders that time was still on Japan's side, even as cities burned and resources vanished. The nation continued forward not because it could win, but because it could not imagine stopping. In this atmosphere, surrender remained unthinkable, not because it was impossible, but because ideology had stripped leaders of the ability to choose it. Emperor Hirohito occupied a position of extraordinary authority and extraordinary restraint. To the Japanese people, he was not merely a head of state, but the living symbol of the nation itself. Tradition placed him above politics, beyond public debate, and distant from the daily mechanisms of government. Decisions were made in his name, orders were issued under his authority, yet the system deliberately insulated him from direct responsibility. This separation was meant to preserve the sanctity of the imperial institution, but by 1945, it had become a dangerous limitation. Behind closed doors, Hirohito was far from detached. He received detailed briefings, questioned his advisors, and followed military developments with careful attention. He understood that Japan's strategic situation was catastrophic. He knew that the Navy was crippled, the air defenses overwhelmed, and the population pushed to the brink of starvation. Unlike many hardline officers, he did not believe that sheer will could reverse material reality. Yet understanding did not automatically translate into action. The emperor's greatest constraint was precedent. No Japanese emperor had ever directly intervened to end a war. To do so would shatter centuries of tradition and risk destabilizing the monarchy itself. Military leaders expected him to remain a unifying symbol, not an active decision-maker. Civilian officials feared that open imperial intervention could provoke backlash or even violence from extremist factions within the armed forces. Silence, therefore, became the path of least immediate resistance. As the situation deteriorated, this silence carried a growing cost. Each day of inaction meant more air raids, more destruction, and fewer options. The emperor found himself trapped between two unacceptable outcomes: remaining passive and allowing the nation to be destroyed, or speaking decisively and altering the very nature of imperial authority. By mid-1945, Hirohito was no longer simply observing history. He was standing at its center, bearing the weight of a decision that only he could make, and one that would define Japan's future long after the war ended. By 1945, the war against Japan had taken on a new and devastating character. What had once been a conflict fought primarily on distant islands and naval routes now unfolded directly over the home islands. Strategic bombing campaigns transformed the sky into a constant threat. Night after night, formations of bombers crossed the coastline, targeting urban centers with a level of destruction Japan had never experienced before. The distinction between frontline and homeland vanished. Japanese cities were uniquely vulnerable. Dense neighborhoods built from wood and paper ignited easily, and once fires began, they spread with uncontrollable speed. Civil defense systems proved inadequate against the scale of the attacks. Firefighting crews were overwhelmed within minutes. Water pressure failed. Entire districts disappeared before dawn. By morning, what remained were scorched foundations, twisted metal, and smoke drifting through streets that no longer existed. The human cost was immense. Adult civilians fled burning homes carrying children, clothing, or nothing at all. Families were separated in the chaos. Shelters overflowed. Hospitals, already strained by shortages, struggled to treat the injured. Many survivors wandered through ruins, searching for relatives whose fate they might never learn. Hunger and exhaustion deepened as supply networks collapsed under repeated attacks. For Japan's leadership, the bombing campaigns exposed a brutal truth. The state could no longer shield its population from the consequences of war. Yet official messaging continued to emphasize endurance and sacrifice. Suffering was framed as proof of resolve, even as morale eroded and fear became constant. The gap between propaganda and reality widened dangerously. The war was no longer abstract or distant. It had become a daily personal struggle for survival, forcing a growing number of leaders and civilians to question how much more the nation could endure. By the final weeks of the war, Japan's leadership was locked in a state of dangerous paralysis. The Supreme War Council, responsible for directing the nation's strategy, was deeply divided. On one side stood hardline military leaders who insisted that continued resistance was the only acceptable path. They believed surrender would erase Japan's honor, invalidate years of sacrifice, and threaten the survival of the imperial system itself. For them, even catastrophic destruction was preferable to capitulation. Opposing this view were a smaller number of civilian officials and senior figures who quietly recognized the reality of Japan's situation. They understood that the military balance was irreversibly lost. The Navy could not defend the coastline. Air defenses were overwhelmed. Cities lay in ruins, and millions faced hunger and displacement. Continued fighting, they argued privately, would not preserve the nation. It would destroy it completely. Yet voicing these concerns openly remained dangerous. This division produced stalemate. Decisions required consensus, but consensus was impossible. Each meeting ended without resolution, while conditions outside the council chambers deteriorated further. Time, the one resource Japan no longer possessed, continued to slip away. Every day of delay meant additional air raids, deeper civilian suffering, and fewer options for negotiation. At the center of this deadlock stood Emperor Hirohito. He was the only figure capable of breaking the balance, yet tradition still restrained him. The system that had elevated him as a symbol now prevented him from acting decisively. The leadership waited, some in hope, others in fear, for the moment when silence would no longer be possible. Japan had reached a point where the question was no longer how to win the war, but whether the nation would survive its end. The decision that followed would not emerge from strategy alone. It would emerge from the collision of ideology, tradition, and reality at the highest level of power. As Japan's internal deadlock deepened, a quiet and desperate search for alternatives began behind the scenes. Some leaders understood that military victory was no longer possible, yet they still hoped to avoid unconditional surrender. The challenge was finding a path that could end the war without shattering the foundations of the state. For these officials, The question was no longer how to fight on, but how to stop fighting without inviting chaos. Attention turned to diplomacy, specifically to the possibility of mediation. Japan still hoped that a neutral power might help broker an end to the conflict on more favorable terms. The Soviet Union, which had not yet entered the war against Japan, became the focus of these hopes. Despite strained relations, some Japanese leaders believed Moscow might serve as an intermediary between Tokyo and the Western Allies. Messages were drafted carefully, avoiding any language that suggested weakness or surrender. This effort, however, was built on illusion. Japan's leaders underestimated the extent of Allied coordination and misunderstood Soviet intentions. While Tokyo explored diplomatic channels, time continued to run out. Allied forces advanced steadily, and preparations for an invasion of the home islands intensified. The gap between Japan's hopes and reality widened with each passing day. Within the leadership, this pursuit of mediation provided temporary justification for delay. Hardliners could argue that resistance must continue while diplomatic options were explored. Moderates could claim that surrender was premature until all alternatives had been exhausted. In practice, diplomacy became another mechanism of paralysis, postponing a decision that everyone knew was unavoidable. For Emperor Hirohito, these efforts offered both hope and frustration. They suggested a possible end to the war without total humiliation, yet they also prolonged the suffering of the population. As diplomatic messages crossed borders and returned unanswered, the emperor faced a growing realization. There might be no acceptable compromise left. The war would not end through negotiation alone. It would require a decisive choice, one that could no longer be postponed. By late summer 1945, the remaining illusions sustaining Japan's leadership began to collapse one by one. The hope that time could still be used as a bargaining tool faded rapidly. Allied pressure intensified on every front, and intelligence reports made it increasingly clear that Japan's enemies were not divided, hesitant, or exhausted. They were coordinated, determined, and preparing to bring the war to a decisive conclusion. The belief that endurance alone could force negotiations now appeared dangerously naive. Years of resistance had not softened Allied demands. Instead, they had hardened them. Each month of continued fighting convinced Allied leaders that Japan's military government would never surrender voluntarily. From their perspective, only overwhelming force could bring the conflict to an end. Japan's strategy of suffering as leverage had failed. Within Tokyo, the consequences of this realization were profound. Some officials began to acknowledge, quietly, cautiously, that the nation had misjudged both the enemy and the nature of modern warfare. The assumption that moral resolve could compensate for material weakness no longer held. Industrial capacity, air power, and logistics had proven decisive. Ideology could not rebuild cities, feed civilians, or stop bombers. This growing awareness deepened the internal crisis. Those who had advocated resistance now faced the possibility that their strategy had condemned the nation to unnecessary destruction. Yet admitting this openly remained almost impossible. To acknowledge failure was to accept responsibility for catastrophe. Silence, denial, and delay persisted, even as the space for maneuver vanished. For Emperor Hirohito, the collapse of these illusions carried special weight. He had tolerated delay in the belief that alternatives might still exist. As those alternatives disappeared, the moral burden of continued inaction grew heavier. the emperor was forced to confront a painful truth. The longer the decision was postponed, the greater the suffering inflicted on his own people. Japan had reached a moment where illusion could no longer substitute for choice. The next step would determine whether the nation ended the war under its own voice or under the total destruction imposed by others. As Japan's strategic options collapsed, the war reached a moment where tradition itself became a barrier to survival. For centuries, the Japanese imperial system had been built on restraint. Emperors reigned, but did not rule. They embodied continuity, legitimacy, and unity, while real authority flowed through councils, ministers, and military leaders. This structure had preserved stability for generations. In 1945, it threatened to prolong catastrophe. Emperor Hirohito understood that the system around him could no longer resolve the crisis. The Supreme War Council remained divided. Military leaders repeated familiar arguments about honor and sacrifice, even as evidence of collapse surrounded them. Civilian officials lacked the authority to impose a decision. The machinery of government continued to function procedurally, but it no longer produced outcomes. Delay became policy by default. For the emperor, this paralysis carried a personal dimension. Each day brought reports of further destruction, cities reduced to ruins, transportation networks collapsing, civilians suffering under shortages and fear. Hirohito could no longer separate the symbolic role he had inherited from the human consequences unfolding across the nation. Remaining silent was no longer a neutral act. It was a choice with measurable cost. Breaking tradition meant more than speaking at a meeting. It meant redefining the relationship between the emperor and the state. Hirohito understood that direct intervention could provoke backlash from extremist factions within the military, who believed surrender would betray the spirit of the nation. There was real risk, not only to political stability, but to his own safety and the future of the monarchy. Yet the alternative was worse. Allowing the system to continue unchanged meant accepting endless destruction in the name of precedent. Gradually, Hirohito came to the conclusion that preserving Japan required an act that tradition did not allow. Authority that had long remained symbolic would have to become decisive. In stepping beyond the boundaries imposed by history, the emperor prepared to take responsibility not only for the outcome of the war, but for reshaping the role of the imperial institution itself. The moment approached when silence would no longer be possible, and the emperor's voice, rare, restrained, and final, would determine the fate of the nation. By the time Japan's leadership gathered once more to confront the question of surrender, the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. What had once been framed as a strategic debate now carried the weight of inevitability. Reports arriving from across the country described a nation pushed beyond endurance. Infrastructure had collapsed in many regions. Transportation barely functioned. Food distribution failed repeatedly. Civilian morale, once sustained by discipline and fear, eroded under the constant pressure of destruction and uncertainty. Inside the highest councils of power, arguments continued, but their tone shifted. Hardliners still spoke of honor and resistance, yet their words sounded increasingly detached from reality. The vision of a decisive homeland defense no longer inspired confidence. Military assessments revealed shortages so severe that even symbolic resistance would be difficult to sustain. The gap between ideology and capability could no longer be ignored. It was within this environment that Emperor Hirohito prepared to act. For the first time in Japanese history, an emperor would directly intervene to resolve a military crisis. The decision was not made lightly. Hirohito understood that surrender would reshape Japan's identity, expose the nation to occupation, and challenge the very foundations of the imperial system. Yet he also understood that continued war promised only annihilation. When the emperor finally spoke, his words carried authority precisely because they were so rare. He did not frame the decision as defeat, but as preservation. Ending the war, he argued, was necessary to save the nation and its people from complete destruction. This framing allowed leaders to accept surrender without fully abandoning their sense of duty. It transformed capitulation into an act of responsibility rather than shame. The emperor's intervention broke the deadlock. Resistance did not vanish, but it could no longer dominate. For the first time, Japan's course was set not by ideology or habit, but by a deliberate choice to end the war. The decision marked a turning point not only in global history, but in the internal structure of Japan itself. Authority, once symbolic, had become decisive, and the war's end was finally within reach. Even after Emperor Hirohito's decision to end the war began to take shape, surrender was not immediately assured. The Japanese state had been built on layers of obedience and hierarchy, but it was also fractured by years of ideological rigidity. For some military leaders, the emperor's intention was not yet a final command. It was a challenge to beliefs they had defended their entire lives. Resistance did not end with a single decision. It had to be dismantled. Within the armed forces, particularly among senior officers, the idea of surrender remained deeply unsettling. Many believed that continuing the war, even under hopeless conditions, preserved honor and justified past sacrifices. They feared that accepting defeat would expose their responsibility for the nation's suffering and undermine the moral framework they had enforced for years. As a result, hesitation and quiet opposition persisted, even as the path toward surrender became clearer. This internal tension revealed how fragile Japan's situation had become. Orders were questioned. Communication slowed. The chain of command, once rigid and absolute, showed signs of strain. Some officers searched for ways to delay implementation, hoping that circumstances might still change. Others struggled internally, torn between loyalty to the emperor and loyalty to an ideology that rejected surrender outright. For Emperor Hirohito, this phase was among the most dangerous. Having stepped beyond tradition to make his will known, he now faced the challenge of ensuring that decision was carried out. The authority of the imperial voice had to overcome years of indoctrination and fear. Any failure at this stage risked plunging the nation into chaos or prolonging destruction against the emperor's own intent. Gradually, the balance shifted. The reality of Japan's condition became impossible to deny. Reports from across the country confirmed that continued resistance would only deepen civilian suffering without altering the outcome. One by one, key figures aligned themselves with the emperor's position. Opposition did not disappear, but it lost its ability to control events. In breaking the will to resist, Japan crossed the final threshold between war and peace. The struggle was no longer against an external enemy, but against the ideas that had sustained the war itself. Once those ideas began to collapse, the end of the conflict was no longer a question of possibility. It was a matter of time. As the decision to surrender moved from intention to action, Japan entered one of the most fragile moments in its modern history. The emperor's will had been expressed, but it still needed to be transmitted to a nation that had never heard its ruler speak directly to the public. For centuries, the emperor's presence had been distant, ceremonial, and silent. His authority was absolute precisely because it was rarely exercised. Now that silence was about to be broken, preparations began for an unprecedented act, a recorded address to the nation. The concept itself was revolutionary. Ordinary Japanese citizens had never heard the emperor's voice. Many had never even seen his image clearly. The address had to be precise, restrained, and carefully worded. It could not openly speak of defeat, yet it had to make the end of the war unmistakable. Every phrase was weighed for its political, cultural, and emotional consequences. Inside the leadership, tension remained high. Some feared that broadcasting the emperor's voice could provoke unrest or even rebellion among extremist elements who still opposed surrender. Others worried that any ambiguity would allow resistance to continue. The recording process was conducted under strict secrecy, reflecting the fragile balance between authority and instability that defined these final days. For Emperor Hirohito, the act carried immense personal and symbolic weight. By addressing the nation directly, he stepped fully beyond the traditional boundaries of his role. His words would redefine the relationship between ruler and people, between state and society. The address would not celebrate victory or rally resistance. Instead, it would ask the population to endure the unendurable, the acceptance of peace after years of sacrifice. When the moment arrived, the emperor's voice did not thunder with command. It was calm, distant, and formal, yet its impact was profound. In that broadcast, authority was no longer abstract. It became human, immediate, and final. The war, sustained for years by silence, ideology, and ritual, was ending through a voice few had ever heard, but all were bound to obey. When the emperor's address was broadcast to the nation, Japan entered a moment of collective shock, unlike anything it had experienced before. Across cities, villages, factories, and farms, people gathered around radios in stunned silence. Many struggled to understand the formal, indirect language of the message. The emperor did not speak plainly of defeat. Instead, he spoke of enduring the unendurable and bringing an end to hostilities for the sake of the nation's future. Yet the meaning was unmistakable. The war was over. For countless civilians, the announcement produced conflicting emotions. Relief came first. Relief that the bombing might stop, that nights in shelters might end, that survival no longer depended on luck alone. That relief was quickly followed by confusion and disbelief. Years of propaganda had promised victory or honorable death. Surrender had never been discussed as a possibility. Now it had arrived not through foreign force, but through the emperor's own voice. Among soldiers and officers, the reaction was equally complex. Many felt disoriented, stripped of the purpose that had defined their lives. Others experienced quiet gratitude that the fighting had ended before total annihilation. For some, acceptance came slowly and painfully as they struggled to reconcile loyalty, sacrifice, and loss with the reality of peace. The sudden absence of war created a void that no ideology could immediately fill. Public response was largely restrained. There were no mass uprisings, no widespread violence. Discipline, long ingrained, held. People bowed, listened, and absorbed the message in silence. The emperor's authority, once distant and symbolic, had proven decisive at the moment it mattered most. His words ended the war not through force, but through legitimacy. In the days that followed, the scale of Japan's transformation became clear. Military operations ceased. Orders were obeyed. The machinery of war began to shut down. What remained was a nation exhausted, grieving, and uncertain, but alive. The surrender did not erase suffering or loss, but it created the first fragile space in which recovery could begin. Japan had crossed from total war into an uncertain peace, guided not by triumph, but by acceptance. In the immediate aftermath of surrender, Japan faced a reality more daunting than war itself. The structures that had governed every aspect of life for years collapsed almost overnight. Military authority dissolved. Wartime ministries lost their purpose. Orders that once demanded sacrifice and obedience were replaced by silence. For millions of Japanese civilians and soldiers alike, the sudden absence of direction created a profound sense of disorientation. Cities revealed the full extent of their destruction. With the bombings over, survivors emerged from shelters to confront landscapes of ruin that had been hidden by smoke and fear. Neighborhoods were reduced to foundations. Infrastructure lay broken. Transportation barely functioned. Food shortages remained severe, and the coming months promised hardship rather than immediate relief. Peace had arrived, but stability had not. Psychologically, the surrender forced a reckoning. The narratives that had sustained the war, honor, endurance, inevitable victory, could no longer explain reality. Families mourned losses without the consolation of purpose. Soldiers returned home, carrying memories of suffering that no ideology could justify. Many struggled with guilt, grief, and uncertainty about their place in a defeated nation. At the same time, the authority of the emperor remained intact. His decision to end the war, though painful, preserved the continuity of the state. This continuity proved crucial. It allowed Japan to transition without descending into chaos or civil conflict. The population, conditioned to obedience, accepted the new reality with restraint rather than rebellion. In these early days of peace, Japan stood at a crossroads. The past could no longer guide the future, yet the future was undefined. What remained was a society forced to confront the consequences of its choices, military, political, and moral. The surrender ended the fighting, but it began a deeper struggle, rebuilding a nation not only in material terms, but in identity and purpose. With the war formally ended, Japan entered a new and uncertain phase under Allied occupation. For the first time in its modern history, the nation was governed by foreign authority. Allied forces arrived not as conquerors in the traditional sense, but as administrators tasked with preventing future conflict. Their presence symbolized both defeat and survival. Japan had lost the war, but it had avoided total destruction. Occupation brought rapid and profound change. Military institutions were dismantled. Weapons were surrendered. Laws that had supported wartime mobilization were abolished. The ideological framework that had justified sacrifice and obedience was systematically dismantled. New principles, demilitarization, political reform, and civil rights were introduced into a society that had been shaped by hierarchy and conformity. For ordinary Japanese citizens, occupation was deeply unsettling. Foreign soldiers walked streets once reserved for imperial authority. Signs appeared in unfamiliar languages. Daily life required adaptation to new rules, new power structures, and new expectations. Yet amid uncertainty, a cautious sense of relief emerged. Bombings had ended. Food supplies slowly stabilized. The fear of immediate annihilation receded. The emperor remained on the throne, but his role was transformed. No longer presented as a divine figure, Hirohito became a constitutional monarch, a symbol without absolute authority. This transformation allowed continuity without dominance, preserving stability while enabling reform. The decision to surrender, once feared as national ruin, now revealed its deeper consequence. It had created the conditions for Japan's reinvention. Occupation forced Japan to confront its past actions and redefine its future. It was not a moment of triumph, but of reckoning. The nation that emerged would be shaped not by conquest, but by the lessons of defeat, and by the choice to rebuild rather than resist. Emperor Hirohito's decision to surrender in 1945 remains one of the most consequential acts of leadership in modern history. It ended a global conflict that had consumed millions of lives and prevented further devastation of Japan itself. Yet its significance extends far beyond the moment the war ended. It reshaped the nation's identity, political structure, and relationship with the world. The decision was not made from a position of strength. It was made under extreme pressure, amid internal division, ideological rigidity, and national collapse. Hirohito chose preservation over pride, survival over symbolism. In doing so, he broke centuries of tradition and accepted responsibility for ending a war his system could no longer control. For Japan, surrender became the foundation of transformation. From the ruins of war emerged a society that rejected militarism and embraced reconstruction. Economic recovery, political reform, and cultural change followed, not immediately, but decisively. The nation's post-war trajectory would have been impossible without the moment when resistance gave way to acceptance. Globally, the decision marked the true end of the Second World War and the beginning of a new era defined by caution, deterrence, and reflection. It demonstrated that leadership sometimes requires choosing the path that history does not prepare for. Hirohito's voice, restrained and formal, carried a message that echoed far beyond Japan's borders, that even in total war, the courage to stop fighting can alter the course of history. In the end, Japan's surrender was not merely an act of defeat, it was an act of responsibility, and it remains a reminder that the most powerful decisions are often made not on the battlefield, but in the moment when a leader chooses humanity over destruction